A Week in the Woods by Andrew Clements, Chapter 8. Discoveries. Mark had already been to his room to change into his warm pants and socks. Anya caught him rushing through the kitchen, zipping up her coat. Hands on her hips, she blocked his way. "No, you don't." "Anya, I don't have time, and I'm really not hungry." She pointed at the kitchen table. "Sit and eat. You are a growing boy, and outside it is very cold." It was the same every afternoon. She always made him eat before he went out. So Mark sat down, popped a cookie into his mouth, and took a gulp of chocolate milk. Anya turned and walked into the laundry room. Before she could come back to inspect, Mark drained the glass and stuffed the other cookies and the apple slices into his coat pocket. He tiptoed to the mudroom, pulled on his boots, grabbed his hat and gloves, and slipped out the door. He had important business in the barn. From his very first morning and at the new house, Mark had been itching to get outdoors and explore. But he'd had to wait. That first Saturday, 2 weeks ago, his parents had arrived about noon. His mom had planned a family weekend. Family weekend was one of his mom's code phrases, and Mark knew what it meant. It meant that on Sunday night or early Monday morning, his parents would be leaving again. They would spend some quality time together over the weekend. And since Mark was sure his mom's idea of quality time didn't include tramping around out in the cold, the outdoors would have to wait until the family weekend was over. Mark and his mom and dad had taken a drive together late Saturday afternoon. They drove through Witston and stopped to take a look at the school Mark would be attending. His dad had said, "Looks pretty small, don't you think?" But his mom quickly said, "I've talked with Mrs. Gibson, the principal, and it's a fine little school. It'll be a good experience. And besides, Mark's only going to be here a few months." There wasn't a lot to see in Whitson, so they headed 16 miles east to Attleboro. It was larger, but there wasn't that much to see there either. They drove around the old center of town, and his mom commented on the quaintness of the home. They drove past the new mall on the outskirts of town, and his dad commented on how slow business must be during the winter. Then they drove back to the new house. Saturday night, Anya had cooked steaks on the indoor grill, and Mark and his parents ate dinner in the old dining room. Later, Mark sat between his mom and dad in their new home theater. They watched a movie and ate popcorn and milk duds and drank some strawberry soda. When the movie was over, his dad yawned and said, "I've got to turn in, guys." That flight from San Francisco was a beast. "You coming to bed now, Lo?" His mom nodded, and it was her turn to yawn. "It's been a long day, but a good one. It's so quiet here. I love that. Don't you, Mark?" Mark said, "I don't know yet, but I can deal with it." "That's what I like to hear," his dad said. "I've been telling your mom to stop worrying about you. When things change, you just have to tough it out. And believe me, everything keeps changing. All your life. That's the one thing you can count on." He yawned again as he stood up. "See you tomorrow, kiddo." And he gave Matt a pat on the back as he left the room. When they were alone, his mom said, "Mark, we're going to have to leave tomorrow afternoon. Will you be okay? I know it's a lot to get used to all at once, and I'm sorry we can't be here for your first day at the new school, but we have to be in New York, and that's that." Mark said, "It's okay, really. I'm glad you came home." And Mark had meant it. He was glad they cared enough to take a cross-country plane trip just to spend a little time with him. Mark knew lots of kids at Lawton Country Day School whose parents wouldn't have bothered. While his dad slept in on Sunday morning, Mark and his mom feasted on fresh-baked Russian pastries, one of Anya's specialties. After breakfast, Mark said, "You know about the room where they say the runaway slaves hid, right? I found it. Come on." Together they wound their way up the narrow steps, Mark in the lead. The room was tiny, just big enough for a rope-frame bed and a small washstand. The walls were made of rough pine boards, and the only light came filtering up from the cupboard door below. Mark's mom had a duck to keep from bumping into the low-beam ceiling. Mark ran his hand along the rail of the bed. He whispered, "Makes you think, doesn't it?" His mom nodded, and then they tiptoed back down the stairs. Sunday afternoon, Mark had gone along for the ride when Leon drove his parents to the regional airport. At the gate, his mom said, "We'll try to be back for next weekend, sweetheart. We love you so very much. And you have a good first week at your new school, all right?" Mark smiled and nodded. "Sure thing. That's my boy." And his dad tousled his hair. "See you soon, Mark." And that was the end of the first family weekend at the new house. Monday afternoon, Mark got home from his first day at the new school and finally got to set off in the great outdoors. After bundling up under Anya's watchful eye, he had gone out the back door of the garage and headed toward the woods that covered the steep slope to the south and east of the house. When he'd returned huffing and puffing 15 minutes later, he was soaked up to the waist, with snow jammed up under his jacket, his face bright red. Leon was waiting for him in the garage. He pointed at a short stool. "Shake off the snow and then sit and catch your breath. Just sit. Now you know that no one can plow through the deep snow. So, I will teach you to go on top of it." Leon slipped the toes of his boots into a pair of long snowshoes, made of bent wood and rawhide strips. He buckled the straps on the bindings, stood up, and said, "First, you watch." Leon shuffled out the front of the garage. He took a few quick strides beyond the snowbanks to the left of the driveway until he was walking where the snow was deep and unpacked. "See? A heavy man, but he only sinks a few inches." He stopped to make sure Mark was watching. Mark was on his feet, all eyes. Moving again, Leon said, "Forward, always forward. Keep your legs apart, so to keep the shoes from banging, and keep the tips up and the tails dragging, just so." Leon came back into the garage. "Now your turn." Bending down, he laced Mark into the bindings of a smaller pair of snowshoes. "These are Anya's. I think too big for you. Still, you can learn." And Mark did. After losing his balance once, and after letting the toes dig in and trip him a couple of times, Mark had gotten the feeling of staying centered on the webbed platforms. With Leon behind him, Mark went back past the tracks he'd left as he had floundered through the 4- and 5-foot snowdrifts on the east side of the house. "Look," he shouted, "it's like I'm floating." When his mom called that night to ask how his first day of school had been, Mark said, "Fine, but you know what? I learned how to snowshoe today. Leon taught me. Anya's snowshoes are a little too big, but Leon said I did great." His mom said, "That's wonderful news, dear. And school was all right? Were the teachers nice? Are the children?" "School was fine, Mom. So, can I get my own snowshoes?" "Of course, sweetheart. If you can't find what you want in Winston or Attleboro, you can shop online. I'll tell Anya it's all right when I speak with her. Get all the gear you need, dear." And that's why Mark and Leon had driven to Scotty's Sporting Goods in Attleboro Tuesday after school. The snowshoes Mark chose weren't made of bent maple and twisted rawhide like Leon's. These were high-tech, state-of-the-art snowshoes made of Vistilic nylon stretched over tempered aluminum frames. Both of Mark's snowshoes together weighed less than one of Anya's. Mark's first 7 days were spent in the woods. From after school until dusk, he tramped uphill and down, from one end of the large property to the other. On moonlit nights, looking out his bedroom window across the meadows, it gave him a good feeling to see his own tracks, crisscrossing the bluish snow. If Mark's first week was about the woods, then his second week was about the barn. He had walked all the way around the barn several times as he explored the property on his snowshoes. He had been curious, but there hadn't seemed to be a way to get in. Deep snowdrifts blocked the doors on the lower level and also those on the end facing west. On the south side, facing the pastures in front of the house, icicles had formed a glittering curtain, adding a thick glaze to the drifts that blocked that doorway. And on the end of the barn closest to the house, the huge double doors were snowed completely shut. Then, on Monday of his second week, Mark felt he just had to get inside of the barn and look around. He asked Leon for help, and together they'd shoveled the drifts away from a smaller entrance to the right of the main doors. Once the snow was cleared, it was easy to enter because the little door swung inward. Mark had looked at Leon as the door creaked open. "Want to come in with me?" Leon smiled and shook his head. "I have work in the house," which wasn't completely true. As a boy in Russia, Leon had explored plenty of old barns. This one was Mark's. The door opened into a room that was about 10 feet wide and 12 feet long. 2 small windows faced the house, each covered with spiderwebs, each loaded with last summer's harvest of flies and moths. Below the windows there was a narrow workbench that would have been about waist high on a grown man. Nails driven into the wall around the windows served as hangers for a pair of pliers, a bent screwdriver, and a hammer with a black tape on its handle, and some small coils of wire. Some nails and screws and a few old hinges were scattered across the bench. Everything was rusty. On the wall opposite the bench was a row of 12 wooden pegs spaced about 6 inches apart, almost too high for Mark to reach. From one of them hung some long strips of leather, part of an old harness, dark and stiff from the sweat of plow horses. And looking at the leather strips, Mark had remembered what a room like this was called. A tack room. 3 rusty horseshoes were stacked on another peg. Mark stood on his tiptoes to lift one of them off. It had a nice feel in his gloved hand, heavy and solid, and he slipped it into his coat pocket. But the best thing Mark had found on that first visit was in the corner of the room next to the crude plank door that opened into the rest of the barn. At first, he thought it was a broom handle or a piece of pipe. He picked it up and took it over to the windows for a better look. Someone had made a walking stick from a straight young tree. It was about 1.5 inches thick at the top and tapered perfectly to about half the width at the bottom. A narrow metal ring, maybe a thin piece of pipe, had been fitted onto the bottom end of the stick to keep it from splitting or wearing away on rocky ground. The top of the stick had been rounded over and carefully smoothed, and in the light Mark could see the whittled cuts left by a knife. 6 inches below the top end, the silver-gray bark had been peeled away, just enough space for a hand to grasp hold, and a series of little ridges had been cut, ringing the stick. Mark had pulled the glove off his right hand to see how the grip felt. Just right. Opening the inner door, Mark stepped out onto the main floor of the barn. The end of the walking stick made a satisfying thump on the worn wooden floorboards. A row of small square window panes above the wide door on either side of the barn let in some light, and Mark could see fine. Looking up, the first thing that caught Mark's eye was a long rope. It hung from the highest beam in the center of the barn, and a loop had been tied in the end that dangled a foot or so above the floor. Mark trotted over, dropped his stick, and jumped up. He grabbed hold of the rope and pulled, testing to make sure it would hold him. He didn't really doubt it, since the rope was almost as thick as the climbing rope in gym class. Running forward with the loop in one hand, he pulled the rope back as far as he could and let it go. It swung out, and when it came back, Mark was ready. He grabbed hold and ran with it, then at the very last second leaped up and clamped his legs around the big knot above the loop. The momentum swept him forward in a long, slow arc, and then back and forth like a pendulum. After a few more swings, Mark had picked up his stick and moved on. The haylofts were about 15 feet off the floor on either side of the open central area. To Mark, they looked like enormous shelves built out from the side of walls. Craning his neck to see better, he thought, "Wonder how you get up there?" Immediately, he saw the answer. The floor of each loft was supported by a row of massive wooden posts that were spaced about every 20 feet. And on several of the posts, boards and cross pieces had been nailed to make a simple box ladder. 20 seconds after this discovery, Mark was up one of the ladders and walking cautiously into the north hayloft, tapping ahead with his stick to be sure the boards were safe. When he got to the wall at the west end of the barn, he turned around and looked back. The inside of the barn stretched out in front of him, almost like it was a diaphragm on a huge piece of paper. The angled support beams marched away from him. The roof sloped gracefully from the peak. The horizontal and vertical supports met at perfect intervals. It all looked so solid, so permanent. Glancing at the realtor's brochure back in Scarsdale, Mark hadn't known what it meant when he read Classic 100-foot post and beam dairy barn. This was like no place Mark had ever been before. Pulling in a slow breath of air through his nose, he sifted the smells. There hadn't been a cow or a horse in the barn for over 30 years, and had been at least that long since a real hay crop had been stored away. Still, even in the thin, cold air of February, Mark caught wisps of all that past life and activity. And looking down, leaning on the old walking stick, he had felt a deep, satisfying connection to the place. Every afternoon of his second week in New Hampshire, Mark had returned to the barn. In the corner under the south hayloft, he found a small sleigh, and next to it, a stack of wooden carriage wheels. He'd found the trap doors that the farmer had used for dropping hay down to the next ground level for the cows and horses. He had also explored the maze of stalls and pens on the ground floor, noticing that the smell of animals was definitely stronger down there. Each day he found new things and added them to his collection in the tack room. He found a rusty shovel with a carved wooden handle, a pitchfork with a missing tine, a small hatchet, a wooden bucket, an assortment of bottles and jars, a short curved sickle, a coffee can full of nails, an old-fashioned grinding wheel with a foot pedal, a length of iron chain, 4 long wrenches, a kerosene lantern, and a foot-shaped anvil that looked like it had been used to repair shoes or boots. During these first 2 weeks, Mark had learned a lot. He learned to snowshoe as he explored the woods. He had learned to read animal tracks in the snow, rabbit, deer, squirrel, and several kinds of birds, mostly chickadees. He had learned to bundle up in layers against the cold and wind, and he learned how delicious food can taste after spending a few hours outside. Besides his discoveries in the barn, Mark found other links with the past during those first 2 weeks. In the woods up on the western ridge, he found a stone fireplace and a heap of boards, the remains of a tumble-down cabin. And on a level place overlooking the meadow, he had found 6 gravestones, surrounded by a low iron fence, a small family cemetery. Digging the snow away from one of the stones, he read the name, Sarah Lynn Fawcett. The date on the headstone was 1825. While Mark was tramping around the property or exploring out in the barn for hours and hours, without even knowing it, he made his most important discovery. All his life, Mark's parents had hired people to fill up his days. Nannies and tutors, teachers and coaches, trainers and counselors, good people, kind people, the very best available. Every spring, every summer, and especially every fall and winter, almost every minute had been filled with important, progressive activities. And then in one day, the day they had moved up here, all that had stopped. Just stopped. No lessons, no tutoring, no sports, hardly any homework. Mark couldn't have explained why he had stopped feeling mad about moving to this place. But after 2 weeks, he had. He couldn't have explained why he wasn't upset that his parents had gotten so busy that they wouldn't be coming back again until March 29th. But he didn't mind at all. True, Mark still resented having to go to school 5 days a week, but he didn't feel neglected or isolated anymore. That's because Mark had discovered time. It wasn't just a sense of history, a sense of time past, that he had discovered. Mark had found his own sense of time present, and he had discovered how much this time was worth. This time was valuable. This time belonged to him. This time was like a bank account loaded with days and hours and minutes, all his. After school and all night and all weekend, Mark could spend his time any way he wanted to. And for the first time in his life, Mark felt rich. On the Friday afternoon of his second week in New Hampshire, Mark felt especially rich. Riding home in the car after school, he'd gotten an idea. An idea had grown to become a plan. Now, it was time for action. Mark hurried out to the barn door among the well-packed trail to the tack room door. Walking quickly into the main room of the barn, he looked around and made some decisions. Things looked good, and he still had about 2 hours of daylight. If all went according to plan, he'd be ready by dark.